For the rest of you, I promise I'm going to come back to something applicable to the present millennium at the end. But first, I have a confession, which is that I came very close to leading you all astray this week, theologically speaking. I'm very sorry to say that. It's a good reminder that even ministers can sometimes be wrong and ill-informed. But I'm going to make good on it today. I've learned a lot this week. And part of it is that back in September, I planned this worship series around this Latin phrase, which you've probably been seeing on the front of your bulletin and thinking, what is that all about? Reformata semper reformanda. I think we should all say that together. That feels so good. Reformata semper reformanda. Okay, cool. That means reformed, always reforming. It's kind of a little like motto for the church. And I learned this way back in Presbyterian polity class in seminary, and I thought it would be a cool idea to introduce to you. Now, the full phrase is Ecclesia reformata semper reformanda est, which is something like the church is reformed and always reforming, or the church is reformed and always being reformed, something like that. This is just a way of talking about how the church has been remade or reformed over time, in a big sense, like in the Protestant Reformation, but also how it's always continuing to be reformed or remade in the present day, right? So that's a cool concept, and I was excited to tell you all about it because Reformation Sunday is coming next week, and we're going to have a guest preacher I'm excited to introduce you to, but I kind of had to get in there with my own thoughts about the Reformation, so this is like a Reformation Sunday prelude that we're doing today. Now, maybe you're thinking, oh no, it's going to be a dry tour through ancient history. But I was thinking, I think this is actually really important. You know, we're here at Rose City Park Presbyterian Church. It says it right on the door. And whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, like we got here, we got to that label by a long and particular road. And the topography of that road actually does continue to shape who we are now. So in that way, like understanding a little bit of our history may help us to understand who we are, and also may help guide us in what grappling there is to do in becoming who we want to be and are called to be by God. So we're going to start there, then we're going to get into why I was wrong about this entire thing, then we're going to get back to applicability in the present. But let's say, just at a very basic level, we are Protestant. I don't want to alarm anybody. We're Protestant. I'm sure you read somewhere in your religious education that 500 years or so, Martin Luther nailed 95 Theses to the church door and sort of started this theological and church polity firestorm, which rents the church into Romans and Protestants. There's also like Orthodox Christians. We don't have time for that today. That's a sermon for later. So the Protestant Reformation generally happened. And we tend to think of that as being back then. But it does deserve our attention. It's really shaped our theological outlook and our perceptions of authority. Right? We believe there's authority in Scripture, but also in our own intuitions. You'll notice if you pull out your Pew Bible, it's in English. Thanks, Martin. As guided by the Spirit, we can understand these things. We also believe God's grace is a gift, not something that's earned. Right? So we could celebrate all this stuff. But if you want to get a little bit more down in the granular, right, we're Protestant, but we're also part of what's called the Reformed branch. How many of you walked in today and thought, I'm a Reformed Christian? One person, okay. 1.3 people. This is the Reformed branch of Protestantism, sometimes known as Calvinism. This is a branch of Protestantism that germinated in the 16th century with the thinking of John Calvin. Right? You sometimes see him with the funny hat, French theologian, exiled to Geneva during the Reformation, where he started developing the body of theological thinking that's the foundation of what we're doing right now. All right, so you had Martin Luther, busted the whole thing open, then it kind of fractured a bunch of different things, and one fracture kind of was the branch called Calvinism, or the Reformed way of thinking. The Reformed way of thinking took root in some particular places in Europe. Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Scotland. That's why you're driving around, you see the Dutch Reformed Church, right? It's the way of thinking this body of work ended up in the Netherlands. Okay, cool. And now in Scotland, these reformed, this is capital R, by the way. You should read this right here. Capital R reformed ideas got mixed in with some other interesting ideas about representational government. Cool. The whole thing got packaged up, got exported here to the Americas, and boom, you've got Presbyterianism. Okay? Now, we need to kind of just revisit this history periodically. Where do we come from? So that's your history. Luther leads to Calvin, leads to Scotland, leads to the Americas, and here we are, Presbyterianism. Lots of other stuff happened during that time, but we don't have time for that today. The main point is the church was reformed, and it's always reforming. Now, all that stuff I just told you is true. I got a little fuzzy on the details after that, actually. I was really excited about this series. I was really excited about this phrase. What I had in mind was this, that this phrase, reformata semper reformanda, had come from John Calvin. If you had asked me that 2 weeks ago, I would have been like 87% sure that John Calvin said that. The second thing I was thinking was that this phrase represented kind of a perpetual commitment to reformation and change. Like on the surface, it sounds like that, right? The church just keeps on changing. We should change some stuff, right? Like, let's get rid of these pews and get some chairs or something. Let's change it up. We're reformed always. I'm not suggesting that before anybody calls a session meeting. Let's just keep doing new stuff. But then this week, I started actually really doing a deep dive into where this phrase comes from, and it turns out I was wrong on both those fronts. First of all, Calvin never said anything about this. He never said anything about reformed, always reforming. That theological insight apparently came from some conversations happening in the Netherlands in the 1600s. Calvin had been dead already for about 100 years. They're talking about this. It seems like the phrase got its beginning with a Dutch theologian, Johannes Hoornbeek, who was talking to some of his theology students about a cycle of renewal and decline that he noticed was kind of characterizing the life of the church. So Hoornbeek noticed folks would get super amped up about some reform. They'd be like, we are going to follow every single thing in the Bible, every single thing. And they get super excited about that and super excited about their own piety, and everybody's super into it. And then it would kind of like wear off a little bit. It would start to sort of decline. People got a little bit lax. Maybe they only followed part of the Bible. They got a little lazy. And they would sort of return to a base state before another reformation came up. And what Hoornbeek suggested as an antidote to this was for the church to consider himself not reformed, like the work's already done, but reforming, the work's ongoing all the time. Now this went in kind of interesting direction in the Netherlands because it became a competition. I didn't know this. There were folks that labeled themselves uber reformed and perpetually reformed and more reformed than anybody else. It was like the Dutch, more reformed than anybody else, church on the corner. Reformed all the time. These were all people identifying themselves. The movement ended up being called the Further Reformation. And it represented a competition about who was more reformed. And it's not totally unlike the dispute James and John are having with Jesus about who's going to be the greatest disciple, right? Now, interestingly, the Further Reformation idea was one theological stream that fed into what became Puritanism, right? The motto of which might be, we're going to do the most and the best piety of anybody. We're going to be so pious, we're going to be the further piousness of everybody all the time, right? Which is like probably, listening to our gospel text today, not the attitude that Jesus had in mind, and says as much to James and John. So we want to kind of protect against that. I'm not worried any of you all are going to become so reformed that you're further reformed, but I'm just putting some guardrails on. But still, I think this idea about being always reformed kind of does merit attention because it's kind of true that we can start to go astray if we think that the work, and by that I mean the work within us and our work in the whole world, if we think that's complete, if we think we've already got it all figured out, if we think we're in the right and need no further introspection, things can kind of get a little bit off track. If you think we're reformed, ED, period, end of the revolution, we've figured it out, then things can get a little dicey because that's not quite right. Humans, it turns out, I don't know if any of you have ever noticed this, they're not perfect. We are not perfect. That was actually one of the main claims of Reformed thought. Humans are not perfect. Humans are tricky. They're prone to selfishness and greed. They're sometimes lazy about caring for their neighbors. They are often happy to have their own biases confirmed rather than seeking discerning new perspectives, right? It's just who we are. And so part of our work, if we can recognize that, it's kind of a perpetual check-in with ourselves, both as individuals and at church, like, how are we doing? We're not done yet. Are we doing what we believe God would have us do, or are we doing what we believe is important, or where are we falling short, right? That's why we have a confession every week. That's part of our work. And there's a way in which that way of thinking becomes an invitation to reformation, just mini reformations happening all the time. God, help to reform me always. Help to keep reforming us always. This is a sentiment of, God, change my heart. God, bring me back to what's really important. Now you'll notice here in this little litany I just said that, and this is consistent with this Reformed theological system of thinking, the work is God's, and ours is a response, right? God reforms us, and we kind of collaborate with that process of transformation, which it turns out is a really important nuance that I had not really metabolized, but I'm glad I have now, because it means that the idea of reformed always reforming is not a perpetual call to innovation. It's not an encouragement to make change for change's sake. And now any of you that were worried about the throwaway thing about the chairs earlier, like, good, she's come to her senses. She knows it's not just about change for change's sake, right? Oh, okay, we'll come back to that. Reformed always reforming isn't a perpetual call to innovation. It's an invitation to listen to God's call in this moment, always in this time. It's an invitation to discernment. It's asking the question, how is God working in us and with us today? Where we don't just start new forms of church because they seem novel or because we feel anxious or because we just haven't changed for a while. We start new forms of church. We pursue new forms of faithfulness because we sense God's call to do that. God's work is the work of reformation. And now maybe you're sitting there thinking, like, what do these ideas from 16th century Amsterdam have anything to do with us, right? We're quasi-Presbyterians living in 2024. How can this apply? I've been thinking about it. I think they do have a little bit to do with us. Firstly, because I think that a tradition that claims the helpful corrective of always needing to be reformed is actually an essential heritage in a time of polarization, political crisis. You know, there's all this rhetoric around us right now, and it's functioning to push us further to unexamined extremes. All of us, not just some of us. This is a very stressful environment in which we are being enculturated to know that we're right and that they're wrong without feeling the need to think too much about it. And I think, and to be clear, I'm not saying we should not maintain our convictions in this environment. We must maintain our convictions. We must not cede ground to others who want to degrade our human siblings and their dignity. I want to be clear about that. But I also want to say that wherever we are, like, there's more work to do. I think that's something that we learned from the Reformation. There will always be blind spots and unplumbed assumptions within our worldview and within our own habits. And those really continue to deserve our attention. I'm trying to say that we don't want to allow our deep commitment to certain principles and movements, which is good and valuable, but we don't want that work to exempt us from the work of examining ourselves and our communities. And it can, when we get into this super polarized state, when all we're doing is pushing against the thing we're against and not having energy to sort of look introspectively in what's going on and to find the places where God's further healing and justice and peace are needed right around us. You know, to give an example, maybe we could feel called to examine even some of the progressive movements of which we're a dedicated part and kind of really look at those for the enduring presence of racial prejudice and oppression, classism and oppression, right? We need to be doing both work at the same time. There's more reformation to pursue. And we don't want to allow our polarized experience of our own rightness make us insensitive to that. So in that way, I think we're gifted by this idea that the Reformer gave us. But a second thing, I think this is even more important, is that this idea of reformation really puts an emphasis on discernment, kind of listening for the guidance of the Spirit, listening for the will of God in our lives. And more it's becoming clear to me this is a critical practice for all of us and for the church together going forward in this uncertain time. Like, it will probably continue to be true that we can't do everything. We cannot be everything. We cannot solve everything. We cannot change everything. We cannot save everybody. And it's easy to just get so overwhelmed by that. And so what can we do? Maybe one thing we can do is be attentive to what God is calling us to be and to do. Not just because it's faithful, but because how we stay grounded in a really tumultuous environment. Right now, like, I know that a lot of you, or maybe let me say a lot of us, are feeling just a huge amount of anxiety about the upcoming election and its potential to destabilize so many aspects of our lives. Right? There's just a lot of like generalized despair out there. It's like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm, right? I feel that. I'm hearing it from all different corners. And I think it's so easy to get overwhelmed. For good reason, right? Because we are worried for ourselves and for our friends and for our families, worried for our communities. I think it's also true that there's a way that the work of discernment can kind of ground us in the middle of that storm, right? Because we know that no matter what happens, we're going to have work to do. God has given us so much work to do, work of protection for the vulnerable, work of advocacy for the silenced, work of repair and peacemaking and justice. And I think there's a way in which discernment just helps us focus the energy, which we could direct to like a general haze of despondency, but we could direct that to particular acts of discipleship, caretaking, and justice. Right? We could ground ourselves in the question, God, what would you have me do now? God, what do you want me to work on? What do you want this church to work on? Right? And that's a discipline of deep listening, and a discipline of attentiveness, and a discipline of prayer that leads us to a certain directedness that I think can keep us on track and keep us living in hope. We still have work to do, and we know what it is, and we can do that knowing that God joins us in it. We don't know what's going to happen. I think that's one difficult thing about this time. But if we learn anything from generations of faithful people who lived before us in very tumultuous times, I'm glad we had the example of this anthem. Those were some people in the Reformation that were living and grappling with their time. You heard it in there. It was very tumultuous, right? That's Martin Luther. We don't know what will happen. We know we'll have some grappling, but one thing that was absolutely true, we hear it in song and prayer and scripture and commentary from that era, is that we know that God will be there with us when it does. We know that God will be walking by our side. We know that God will be offering us new insights about how to live in our moment. We know that God will be calling us to new responsibilities, as God has always done. And we know that that work will not be ours alone to do. It will be shared here by the community. It will be shared with the Spirit who inspires us, and it will be ongoing. I think the promise of the Reformation is that even as imperfect as we are, that we will rise to meet those challenges like our ancestors did, and that we will do it with a sense of faithfulness and dedication. So that's our invitation today. That's the invitation, I think, that's coming up next week, and I'm glad for the opportunity to share that with you today. So I ask that God would bless these words, the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.